I truly believe that we are collaborators with the Almighty, um, and that if we are going to get better, we're going to have to do more to get better. And one of the buys this farm, and the farmhouse is in horrible repair, and barns have fallen over, and land has not been tended for years, and the old farmer buys this farm. And he begins to work the land, and he begins to restore the house when he has time, and he gets the barns upright. About 3 or 4 years later, the preacher comes by to visit, and the preacher says, "Farmer Brown, it's just amazing what you and the Lord have done at this place." And the farmer said, "Preacher, you should have seen it when the Lord had it all by himself." Amen, brother. Well, I like that story because it says something about we must be collaborators with the Spirit of God. And so if we're going to, if we're going to use, that means we have to be active. And if we're going to take care of ourselves, then we have to be active. So it's really been delightful for me. It's been delightful for me to make some new friends, meet people. I really never wanted to go someplace and do one thing for one night and go home. I love it, so we can establish relationships and get to know each other. And so thank you for having me here. Tonight we're going to talk about how is it that we can find ways to care for God's people. And I'm going to say a few things that we talked about last week. Repetition is a good form of education. One of my colleagues and buddies, students now at Vanderbilt, makes a good point, that passage in Isaiah where it talks about Jesus coming to preach the good news. He helps us understand that that's really a portion of that text, and I think it's probably sent a wrong message to a lot of preachers, because the text really does not say that he came to preach the good news. The text says that Jesus, the prophecy is, he came to be the good news. And the word really has to do with him coming to be the enfleshment of the good news. I guess it was, y'all help me, Saint Francis, I think, who said, preach the gospel all the time, and if you must, use words. Okay, and so this goes back to last week talking about silence, and I think we could sustain silence for 8 seconds. Is that what we did last week? We could manage silence for 8 seconds. We'll work on that tonight. Maybe we can get to 15 or 16 seconds. So the idea is to be the good news, and that's what we want to do as we try to care for God's people. I want us to understand that when we go and sit with people, whether we're Stephen ministers or whether we're friends or family, I want us to understand the difference between what we call pastoral conversations. And you can have pastoral conversations, okay? These conversations are not limited to Walt and Susan and John and me and Mary. You can engage in pastoral conversations, because to be pastoral, really what to be pastoral means is to be on speaking terms with God. And so if you're on speaking terms with God, then you have the right to be the good news, to be the enfleshment of the good news. I have spent my professional life, part of it, training pastors in this area. through the work of CPE down at Baptist Hospital. Wherever you were in 1982, I was there. And that's what we do at Baptist. All the chaplains at Baptist, if you ever get a bad chaplain at Baptist, he or she is a student. Okay? I can't say the same thing for the brain surgeons, but I can say that all the chaplains are students. They're either in a residency program, training to be hospital chaplains, or they are mandated by their denomination, Episcopal being one, that they must be in the hospital for a 400-hour unit to learn skills in pastoral care and counseling, to learn what it means to be involved in crisis ministry, to learn how to work with people in death and dying, and in joyous situations, okay? And so this is what I've done for a long time. And it's amazing to me still that we need to understand that there's a major difference between a pastoral conversation and a social conversation. There's nothing wrong with social conversations, okay? If you've ever read any of John Claypool, for example, John Claypool, great book. It's really not a book. Tracks of a Fellow Struggler. When I was in a former life, I was Southern Baptist, and Claypool in a former life was Southern Baptist, and he was pastor of Crescent Hill Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky, where we moved in 1975, I guess it was, to go to Southern. 1970, Claypool's daughter at age 12 was diagnosed with leukemia. And as you can remember back then, prognosis was poor. It's very good now. And Laura Lou lived for 18 months and died. And if you can ever find a copy, and I think you can find the copies pretty easily now on Amazon. John died about 6 years ago and everything was brought by and reprinted. The book is 4 sermons, and it's the first sermon he preached after her diagnosis. It is the second sermon is a sermon he preached when she went into remission, when she came out of remission. Third sermon is the first sermon he preached after her funeral. And the fourth sermon was about 3 years later. He had moved to a big church in Fort Worth and preached a sermon reflecting back on that time. And I got to know John in New Orleans for about a year. We were able to study together and work together. He told me a story one day that his daughter was in this horrible writhing pain in the hospital in Louisville. And he was there with her. And one of his deacons came in and sat down by her bed. It was a Sunday afternoon. And he started telling her about having taken his 2 kids to the zoo, to the Louisville Zoo the day before. And John watched as this deacon friend magically spun these stories about animals and what they were doing and what it was like. And John said for about 30 minutes, Laura Lou did not experience any pain. And he sat in the corner and wept watching this happen. Well, that's really a social conversation, okay? And there's nothing wrong with social conversations unless it's poorly timed, okay? Social conversations tend to focus on external subjects, the weather, the world events, local events. So that means that in the last week we could talk about Hurricane Matthew, or we could talk about Hurricanes Trump and Clinton, or whatever is happening locally. And so many times in our conversations, because we can't manage silence and because we can't manage the anxiety, we tend to focus on external subjects rather than the person. Many times in social conversations, we tend to want to maintain a congenial atmosphere. We want to be liked. We want things to go well. And so we're not really able to accept the tension that is real in the moment. For example, you know someone is at a local hospital, you know they're having major surgery the next morning, and so you go by to visit because you feel like it's your duty to go by and visit. You want to, and there's a little tinge of obligation, okay? So it may be a whole lot easier to go in and talk about the weather and be congenial rather than trying to ask, tell me how you're doing. Tomorrow's a big day for you. The interesting thing, remember the second week we talked about suicide, okay? And one of the things we said was, don't ever shy away from asking someone if they are suicidal. What we know is that people like to be asked. People feel cared for, people feel attended to, and it's okay. And so it's okay to say, how you doing? Tell me how you are. Or to try to produce comfort that is really comfort through avoiding the significant topics, as opposed to comfort through facing fears. We all love, I'm being sarcastic, inane chatter. Does it grate on you like it grates on me? Let me go ahead and tell you right now, okay? If you ever hear that Sandra's having surgery, please do not come sit with me. Okay? Text me. I cannot tolerate being in a room with inane chatter. And the reason why I know that is because I've done it. Been a part of it. What is wrong with people sitting and honoring the moment and simply being silent? I've told y'all some stories about people who share stories. I know she's going to do fine because my grandmother did fine with that same surgery 20 years ago. So we share stories and we trade war stories and we show all the wounds, and we think that's helpful, rather than allowing the person to talk about himself or herself and what the fears are, what's happening in his or her life. We want people to be pleasant and positive. But I want someone who can be empathic. And what it means to be empathic is I'm going to be able to sit with you and I'm going to be able to say, this is really horrible. And all I can tell you is, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to be here. This is the way it's going to be. Great story, true story. John and Ann have heard this story. When I was 48, I suffered a massive heart attack. I died down at Baptist twice in the ER. And Sandra was over in Mobile. It was her mother's birthday. And so somebody got her on the phone, and I didn't know any of this. I was kind of out of it. They got a stent in, and I woke up the next day somewhere in the hospital. But all these people gathered, this cloud of witnesses gathered around and sat and our two kids were in Memphis and they had gotten in. They sat and they were present. And Bob Snowden, my dear friend Bob Snowden, orthopedic surgeon, he was there, and he was, you know how doctors get, when they get anxious, they get really wordy and technical, and they have to use big words, and you say, oh. Well, Bob was there to help translate for Sandra. And again, she had gone to Mobile that morning, and I had driven myself to the hospital, which was stupid, don't ever do that. And coded in the hospital on the floor, so anyway, different story. So anyway, so they're outside the heart cath lab, and they're all kind of gathered around. Silent, which was nice, I'm told. Heart cath nurse comes out and says to Sandra, we're taking him out. He's coming out next. We're taking him to CCU. So Bob leans over and says to Sandra, Sandra, he's taken a huge hit. And he's going to look really, really different. Okay? You need to be ready for that. And everybody kind of hears that. So the doors open, and out rolls this 60-year-old black man. And Sandra looks at Bob. And Bob said, I didn't know he looked that good.
That was funny.
So everybody gets into this uproar, laughter. And of course, I hear this story 2 weeks later. But it had to do first with their ability to gather together in silence and simply surround my family with that kind of love and support. There was no need for all of this. My belief is the people receiving the care don't have any use for this. Maybe it's just me. We very quickly can get into generalizing. We can very quickly get into telling people what they should say or what they should do, rather than asking people, what do you think? What do you feel? How are you? What do you need? Social conversations can focus on attempting to entertain. Pastoral conversations focus on intimate sharing. And again, a lot of this has to do with one's ability to hold on to one's anxiety and live in some comfort with silence. And so we have people who want to go and talk about the religion and differences between Methodists and Episcopals and Baptists and Catholics, rather than talking about God. Myron Madden was one of my gurus, and he was such a wonderful, wonderful mentor and supervisor. And one day he went up to see this fellow who had been in some awful automobile accident, and he was in this body cast and halo, and he had been like this for 3 weeks. And Myron sat down and said, well, you've been looking straight up for about 3 weeks. What have you and God been talking about? And this guy pours out what's happening to him. there's a story here for you. I thought that was pretty cool. He was a hero, Myron was. Sure enough, God put in front of me about a week later a similar situation where this guy had been in a horrible accident, body cast halo on his back, walked in, very quickly knew what to do, pulled up a chair, sat down, said, well, you've been looking up in the heavens for a couple of weeks. What are you and God talking about? He said, what the hell do you mean? You can't use anybody else's language. You've got to discover your own language. You've got to get your own voice. Myron's voice worked for Myron. My voice won't work for you. And I think this is really important, that you do not ever go to any situation where you're the caregiver and tell your story. It is still amazing to me how many caregivers, how many pastoral caregivers have a need to believe that their story is somehow going to be helpful to this person who is facing, or in whatever valley they're in, it is not helpful. And I can prove that to you is think about your own seasons of despair. Think about your own seasons of disorientation and how much it did not matter to you when people told you one of their stories. Why do they do it? It fills up the air, back to inane chatter. It keeps the silence away. It's okay to say, I'm curious. Tell me where you are in your faith. Tell me your stories. There are three levels of communication. I'm kind of borrowing from the Greek. Does anyone know the definition of anti-penultimate? Okay. Okay. What? Say it.
So the next to the next to the last.
The second to the last. Right, good, perfect. One of the things that started doing a long time ago was in training clergy, and then I think it's good stuff for us. When you are in a caregiver, you go to visit someone who has experienced a loss, a death, or a divorce, or whatever. I like to listen to conversations on three different levels. The first is what we call anti-penultimate conversations. What this means is this. Let's say that we go to see someone in the hospital, and we walk in to visit, and the person starts talking about the fact that the Jell-O is warm and the coffee is cold, and housekeeping missed some dust over in the corner, and whatever else. You know, it's tough to listen. Any hospital in this city, any hospital anywhere, any acute care hospital, let's just play with this. Let's say the 300 patients at Baptist right now, okay? What percentage of those 300 patients were admitted through the emergency room? Somewhere between 120 and 150. Okay, and so this means between 40 and 50% of the patients did not wake up this morning and say, I think I'm going to stop by the ER Baptist. Something happened. They got real sick, or they were in an accident, or something, some act of violence. Okay? And so all of a sudden, people are losing control. So you get to the ER, and what do? They take your clothes. And they give you a gown that doesn't work. Okay? And all of a sudden, you're losing more and more and more control. And what happens when we humans lose control? We get angry, we get judgmental, and we get scared. Okay? And so I go see somebody, and they were in the hospital, and they start talking about the Jell-O and the coffee and the dust. So what I know to do is, I know to say, this is symbolic language. Okay? They're whistling through the graveyard. Okay? This is not the issue. But I'm not going to say, hey, this is not the issue. I learned St. Christopher's. This is anti-penultimate conversation, and you need to get away from that. Okay? So we just listen. But I know that these are shallow, surface conversations that allow the person to get some sense of control, some sense of ownership, and maybe reduce some fear. But at least to try to find a way to vent the anger. And so we just let it happen. Okay. So then we have penultimate conversations. What's the definition of penultimate? What?
Before the ultimate.
Before the one before the ultimate. Okay. So we have a person, anti-penultimate, who's saying all these things about Jell-O and coffee and dust. And so I may say, wow, you're in the hospital. Sorry, what's happened? Tell me what's happened. If you decide to stay in social conversations, if we decide to stay in social conversations, if we decide to stay on the anti-penultimate, we say, I kind of like warm Jell-O. Or, I'd be really happy to run down to Starbucks and get you a hot cup of coffee. That's not the issue. Okay? So, the person may then begin to talk about the fact that I really do need to get to work. I'm on commission. If I'm not working, I'm not getting paid. I've got 2 dogs and 3 cats, and I need to get home and take care of these animals. I love them dearly. I'm supposed to keep the grandkids on Friday. I need to get home. That's a little bit closer to what's really happening. Okay, and so I'm thinking, okay, we're not here, we're here. Good. It gets closer to what's reality. Okay? So we have anti-penultimate conversations, and we have penultimate conversations, and we have ultimate conversations. One of the things I tell pastors is that rarely will you walk into a hospital room or in any setting and the person says, I really am afraid I'm going to die. We're just not equipped to do that. But ultimate conversations go back to those pastoral conversations. Tell me your holy stories. Tell me about your fear and your pain. Tell me what hurts. And so when I engage in a conversation, whether it's in the hospital or office or wherever it is, I've kind of trained myself to start with, okay, where are we here? Now, it is true that not everybody wants to be involved in ultimate conversations. That's okay. That's their right, that's their privilege. And so we've got to be very sensitive that some people just don't want to do that. Remember, I think I guess it was last week we talked about Kubler-Ross. And when she was doing her work, patients who received terminal diagnosis were not told, because the doctors believed that it'd be too upsetting. And one of the things she discovered, as we talked about last week, was not only did the patient know that they were terminal, they usually believed it really was because of the silence. Okay? But there are people who simply do not want to talk about those things. When I started residency at Southern Baptist Hospital, we were talking about that earlier in New Orleans. And I didn't know anything, okay? Nothing. And I got called to the floor, and there was this 27-year-old woman, absolutely nice person, married, 3 kids, and she had just been given a diagnosis of horrible cancer and a horrible prognosis, and she had made the decision to not undergo treatment. And all the doctors and all the nurses wanted the chaplain to talk her into undergoing treatment. And so I felt compelled to do that, because I didn't know any better. And so I turned this thing every way I could turn this thing, and she was not going to have treatment. We were in New Orleans. She lived in Ocean Springs, Gaucher, and ultimately she got in the family car and went back. And we never heard anything about her again. She probably died within 6 months. But she simply did not want to deal with ultimate issues. Well, isn't that our right? Okay.
But don't you think we've got to be ready when the loved one or the patient wants to talk about the fact that they're dying and they want to, I think we need to listen. I know that happened recently with me and my brother.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it happened some in the army too.
Unfortunately for the pastoral care people at the hospitals, it happens at 2 a.m. where a patient says to a nurse, could you get a chaplain? Because everything gets real still and quiet, and that's when they want to talk. Yes, we always need to be ready to listen. We do. The point of the story is that some people are, and some people ultimately will. And so all I can do is go and be a presence and engage in pastoral conversations and try to move conversations from penultimate to ultimate. Sure. But it's not always going to happen. Okay. Yeah.
What you just described, if I were a patient, and I decide not to have treatment, isn't that my ultimate decision? Say, listen, I don't want to do this. It's
Okay.
not that I want to be feared to die. It was not that I want fear of treatment. It's that this is what I want. And you just probably say we need to listen to the person. We need to listen to the feelings. So I have the right to say, you know what? I'm not doing it. And I don't think that I'm not avoiding the ultimate conversation because obviously I know the consequences.
What I would do is I would pull up a chair and sit and say, that's great. Can we talk? Let me get to know you. Let's have a conversation. Sure. But I'm not going to invade that place. Sure. I mean, there are people all over town right now who are saying, I'm not going to have any more treatment. Sure. Is there another question? Okay. So I would encourage you to, when you engage in these kind of conversations, and it can be with someone who's depressed or anxious or suicidal, or someone who is grieving. Okay, everything we've talked about for the last 6 weeks. Okay, I would encourage you to kind of play with this, and play means not have fun or be stupid, but to kind of play with the idea. What kind of conversation is this? Is this anti-penultimate? Is this penultimate? Is this ultimate? What could I do to move it one place closer? Yeah. Some things that I want us to remember, and we touched on this last week. Pastoral care is never theological education. Well, I think God wants you to, because Scripture says that's generally not helpful. 10 times out of 10, at least, it's not helpful. If we are indeed attempting to be the good news, then we're going to give people enough space to deal with whatever it is they need to deal with. Most people don't really care for someone to drop some theological load onto whatever it is they're dealing with. So it's probably not helpful if you're in front of someone who is actively suicidal. It's probably not helpful to say, Scripture says you're going to hell. Don't you believe in God? Don't you believe in a God of hopefulness? It'd be a whole lot more helpful to say, tell me about your pain. Tell me what hurts so much that you think you want to die. We had some fun with this last week, avoid the use of cliches. Again, cliches are statements that used to have meaning, used to have some value, but they were so used and so used and so used and overused that the words became meaningless and shallow and superficial and empty. Let's try to go through them again. Some of you were not here last week. Some of your favorite cliches are:
It's God's will.
is God's will.
Everything happens for a reason.
Everything happens for a reason.
You'll be better tomorrow.
You'll be better tomorrow. You'll be a better place.
I'm sorry. That comes up quite often.
Okay, I'm sorry, okay?
What's that?
Well, it
What did he say?
I'm sorry.
I feel your pain.
I feel your pain. Yeah, that's never the case, yeah. God doesn't put more on you than you can bear. When God picks the flowers, he only picks the loveliest. God needed another angel. And as we said last week, the problem with that statement is the first two words. God doesn't need anything. Okay. But why do we use those words?
Because we don't know what to say.
We don't know what to say. I do believe the words are well-intentioned,
And we want to fill the silence.
and we want to fill the silence. Listen, it's kind of like it's always about silence, okay? I think y'all are picking up on that. It's always about silence. Okay? We do not like to sit and be in silence. Got a really dear friend who went through a divorce, and older guy, no kids, and we were talking one day, and he was talking about how miserable he was, and just went home and blah blah blah. And very, very spiritual person, and so I suggested that he go over to Grand Coteau. There's a monastery about 60 miles from New Orleans. I think it's a Jesuit monastery, and they host silent retreats, and you can go for 3 days or 8 days or whatever. And so I said, you may want to go over there and spend some time. They have spiritual directors, and it's a silent retreat. Okay, it's a silent retreat. So he thought maybe that was a good idea. He trusted me, and so he called over there and signed up for a 7-day silent retreat, which I probably would not have suggested. But about 4 days into it, he called me. He was already back here. And I said, what happened? He said, well, last night I was sitting there, and it was crazy. I said, same thing I do at home. What am I doing here?
Plus he's paying for it.
Plus he's paying for it, okay? And he can't talk. I mean, not even an option. And so he decided to come home and work on some other issues in his life. We don't like silence. And so we say things that we don't want to hear. And
With ADHD children, if it's silent, they'll make their own noises like little cars. But I just have a question to ask.
okay.
Okay, when my mother died, it was a horrible experience. Not so much, because of her death, but the interaction. I had one brother, we would have just preferred to have been very quiet. And, there were children around. And I had another one that wouldn't shut up. He kept telling jokes. When I was a child, I got kicked by a horse. And he has a
God
bad
never gives you more than you can bear.
no, and he has a very bad temper. So I was sitting up there with 300 stitches, and he lost his temper, and he kind of threw a Time magazine at me. Well, right in the middle of her death, he brought that up. And my daughter, who had never heard the story, it just blew her mind. So when you're in a situation like this, and you have somebody that won't shut up, how do you get them to shut up?
I leave the room. I do.
Yeah,
I just get up and leave.
Yeah, well,
If everybody would do that, it might send a signal.
Yeah, well, we're all different religions, and we just so happened that her minister, just happened to leave, and it was like interim time.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look back, it would have been nice to have somebody there in the form like a mediator, because it went a long time.
And that's exactly what we're talking about, okay?
Yeah.
And so all I can do is be the silent person, and if I need to leave, and I'll do that. I mean, plus I'm an introvert, so it's double.
But But in a situation where somebody is, I mean, it doesn't have to be mine particularly, where they're just going on and on and on, how do you placate them? You know, when, you know, like they're saying, well, she'll have a big gas when she dies. Well, we don't want to hear about that. You know, how do you placate them?
I'm not good at that. I don't know.
This table has a solution. Send them out for that hot Starbucks.
Yeah.
Yeah, take it off the lot, yeah.
That's an idea.
Yeah.
But because we're gonna see in situations where there's
Right,
other situations, not mine particularly,
right.
and how do you tone? I mean, everybody deals with it in their own way. And
Yeah,
they have a right to that.
They do, and so if I have to leave, I'll leave. And that's what I do. But again, the cliche is to have noise. It is well-intentioned. And it's also theological education. So it really breaks two rules. Okay? And so when we're talking, you know, if you can pay attention to what you want in your own seasons of disorientation, if you can pay attention to what you want, that's really the best guide to tell you what to do, George.
In some situations, why can't you just say, I need some peace and quiet right now?
Yeah,
That's what we say.
you can say that. Yeah, I need some peace and quiet. Over here. Yeah. Right here.
I have a question. If a person is a good pastor, has great empathy with the person, and the person dies, and he's around this environment of dying friends and patients that he has empathy with, what is the defense of the pastor? This would tear up most people.
What do you mean, what is the defense of the pastor?
If you're around people that you have empathy with, you're sharing their pain.
What do pastors do with their
Yes,
pain?
the pastor shares the pain.
Yeah.
And that would hurt, they would eventually need some type of defense from being repeatedly hurt.
Well, you just asked me a question that's right in my wheelhouse, and we could be here all night, okay? Let me tell you a couple of things about pastors, okay? I'll tell you a good story, but I won't say the name. One of our beloved pastors in town, he was retired, not an Episcopal, retired at 62, had been in the church for many years. We were having lunch about a year after his retirement. And I asked him, I said, I mean, church was great, you're healthy, you're great, things are going well, why'd you retire? He looked at me and he said, Don, I got tired of burying my friends. One of the things we know about clergy, and we know this through all the psychological testing that we do, one of the things we know about clergy is that we feel things twice as deeply as you do, on average. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, anybody ever taken that wonderful test? 566 true false questions? Okay. I do all the evaluations for the Methodists, for their folks going into ministry, and we use MMPI. And we have to score the MMPI differently for clergy as opposed to non-clergy. Because if you look at it, it's pretty whacked out. But then when I say, oh, this guy wants to be a pastor, it makes sense. Clergy feel things twice as deeply, on average, as non-clergy. So part of my passion, if I could write a federal law, it would be that every pastor has a pastor. Truth of the matter is, about 98% of our pastors don't have pastors. And 99% of our spouses of pastors don't have pastors. Okay, that's a mess. Okay, it's why I believe that pastors are first responders. Just like law enforcement, just like EMS, I believe Susan is as much a first responder as any police officer. Okay? She's always on call. She's always subject to some trauma. Okay? And so what we have to keep doing, those of us who do these things, we have to keep working toward clergy help. Because the other side of this is, here I go, the other side of this is, Lilly gave Duke Divinity School $16 million to study clergy health. $16 million. They could have given me 2 or 3. I would have told them the same thing. Okay, they take 100 clergy and they do all these psychological tests, physical tests, blah blah blah. They take 100 lay people, same test, physical, psychological, everything. Every time, clergy are twice as sick as lay people. Twice the depression, twice the obesity, twice the psychosomatic illness, twice the heart disease, twice everything. Clergy rates for suicide higher than national average. Be kind to your pastor. I get an amen out of that? I get an amen. Amen.
Hey,
Hey.
we'll send you to get on down and do some push-ups.
So that's a great question, and that's important, and that's something that we don't pay enough attention to. Okay. I was talking to Ann about this earlier. One of the things we also know, okay, beware. We know now from 10 and 15, 20-year studies that if you're caring for a dementia patient, or if you're caring for an ALS patient, or if you're caring for whatever, the studies are showing us that the caregivers are just as sick as the care receivers. Because the caregivers are so focused on taking care of the one who is sick that they stop taking care of themselves. So, what better place than the church to develop support groups, respite care, for those who are continually, perpetually giving care? There's no better place than the church to do that. Question?
Yes, this is a problem I'm dealing with now. My mother's 93. Until Christmas of 2014, she was driving and gardening, and since then there have been many events. She is fortunate, I think she thinks she's fortunate to be alive. We've talked about death since 1981 when my father died. We've always talked about her being willing, able, she's not afraid. She used to be to die. She was told at one time in the hospital that she could take certain treatments or not. And she chose not, and back her all the way. I always have. She called my sisters and said goodbye. She loved them a lot, and she survived. And she's at home, her home now, and she has 24-hour care, and she will not take care of herself. She won't take her medications. And she says, I don't mind if I die. I've had a wonderful life. God's been good to me. My children are wonderful. But here's the problem. If she doesn't take her medications, she's likely to have a stroke. And that would be worse than dying. So I just don't know how to handle this, and it's a really tough place for me to be.
You don't want to not honor her, and you don't want for her to suffer needlessly.
I don't want things to be worse than they are. They're bad now. But she's not, she can talk, she's not paralyzed. These are terrible things that can happen because she won't even take an aspirin.
Well, let me be honest. There's a part of me that says, let her do this her way. And there's a part of me struggles,
Trying to.
and there's a part of me that struggles to say that. And I think that your struggle, well, my struggle would be trying to manage my guilt and my fear. And I hope you have someone to sit with and stay in touch with all of this. And this is one of the blessings and curses of modern medicine. We were not having this conversation 40, 50 years ago. And if there were an easy answer, you would have already come upon it. And so you do what you feel comfortable doing.
Well, I go along with her. That doesn't mean no.
Well,
I totally agree with her. I keep telling her, you are in charge of yourself. But repeat after me. If I don't take this medicine, I might have a stroke.
yeah.
You understand that? And then do what you want to do.
I want you to have someone to walk with you through this.
That's what Bill says.
Well, Bill's right. Blind squirrel gets a
Once in a
nut.
while, everybody gets to be right.
Blind squirrel gets a nut every now and then, yeah. Thank you. That is a painful story. Over the weekend, I received a wonderful email from Susan, and she sent to me a New York Times article of October 1st, titled The Art of Condolence. If you want to jot this down and go look it up, I would certainly suggest that you read this. New York Times, October 1, written by a fellow named Bruce Feiler, The Art of Condolence. Really, really wonderful article. And so the person is telling a story about something that happened to a lady. And we want to talk about when you are caregiving. We're not going to say, at least your mom has lived to 94. Okay, we're never going to say that. Or at least your mom is lucid and able to talk. We're not going to say that. Don't ever start anything with at least. So this lady's 43-year-old husband was killed in a biking accident, leaving her a single mother of their 5-year-old son. She started writing about this, and she singled out two expressions that were particularly upsetting. The first was, someone said to her, "At least he died doing what he loved." She said, "Getting hit and run over by a van was not his love. Riding a bike was." I could hardly read it. The other expression, "At least you weren't married for so long that you can't live without him." "Thank God we were only married for 9 years," she said. "Dodged a bullet there." Never, ever, ever begin your caregiving with "at least."
What's amazing is everything that you talked about last week was in this article.
Thank you. I'm going to hit it one more time. Positive use of silence, what I call the non-anxious presence of God. Commented on Palmer Parker last week. I love this quote. The shadow behind the fixes we offer for issues that we cannot fix is, ironically, the desire to hold each other at bay. It is a strategy for abandoning each other while appearing to be concerned. When you speak to someone about your deepest questions, you do not want to be fixed or saved. You want to be seen and heard, to have your truth acknowledged and honored. Questions?
Did you say the name of the book of John Claypool?
Tracks of a Fellow Struggler.
Don, do you think that if there is such a relationship, that holding the dying person's hand is appropriate? I saw Sister Mary Francis at the Haven when I was a pharmacy consultant. She held so many people's hands, and it was natural for her. And when my younger brother just died, his family held his hand, and I think it helped. How do you feel about that, if there is a comfortable relationship in doing that?
If the dying person wants to have his or her hand held. Some people do, some people don't. So, yeah, I do.
And just silent. Silently holding the hand.
Yeah. You know, there's a program now, a volunteer-led program called 11th Hour. And there are several people in town who volunteer at different hospice organizations. And if someone, if a hospice patient is near death, and we know what that looks like, and there is no family, they call one of these volunteers, and one of these 11th Hour volunteers goes, and they sit in 2 or 3 hour shifts because it's so intense. It's like pretty much all you can manage. And they sit with that dying person until the person dies. And they're trained to try to pick up on, does this person want to be touched or not? Does this person want to be prayed with or not? Does this person want music in the room or not? And so I think these are things that are important. And sometimes, if it's a family member and you know, yeah. But you know, there are times that we don't know. It really is in other parts of the country, it's called No One Dies Alone. Here it's called 11th Hour. It's really.
There's another local group called Trauma Relief, and they're starting their training program, which is too expensive weekends.
Trauma Intervention Program, TIP.
Yeah, it starts at the end of October.
Yeah, they do good work.
Talk to me, I'll give you the contact.
Okay, and they do really, really good work throughout the community. Yeah. Mary.
This thing about silence, when I was in a parish in Iowa, where there was a family there everybody was always at each other's throats. And the patriarch was in his last days, and he was in hospice care. And his family, they were just like little crows or whatever, hovering around him all the time, trying to fix everything that had been wrong through their whole adult lives. And finally he looked up and he said, I just want y'all to get out of the room. And so go have some lunch or something. And they did, and I stayed because he asked me to. And he said, would you just read a psalm to me? said, of course, what do you want? He told me, I think it was the 121st Psalm, something that he really liked. And he and I were good friends. He and Joel and I were really good friends. And he said, thank you for reading the Psalm, and then he died. They just needed to get out of the room and leave him alone so he could die in peace. And, you know, and then of course the family blamed me. They thought I killed him. But, you know, they were that kind of family. Let's blame somebody else for the problem. And I wanted to say one other thing. The first pastoral call I ever made on anybody in the hospital taught me that I needed to be prepared for anything, because I went in there. It was in a rural community, and it was a farmer who was about 75 years old. And he'd been riding around on these old tractors, you know, with the iron seats, and he'd gotten prostate cancer. I don't know why, it was a seat or whatever, but I wasn't sure what was wrong with him. It was my very first call as a pastor. And I went over there, it was in Omaha, and went into his room and introduced myself, and, you know, I said, well, how are you feeling today? And he said, well, I'm not feeling too bad for somebody that just had my prostate operated on. You want to see my scar? He throws back his blankets, and what am I going to do?
That would be a penultimate conversation.
So I've always thought, you have to be ready for anything. Anything can happen.
Oh. Don't quit your day job. Yeah, you do. Yeah, and I remember when I went to Southern Baptist in '77, and there was an Episcopal priest chaplain who was retiring, and he had been a hospital chaplain for 47 years. I don't know why I remember this. And we were talking at his reception, kind of his farewell, and I said, I'm just starting. What can you tell me? How could you be helpful to me? And he said, I can help you. Every time you knock on the door, be afraid. Because you never know. Right?
One of the most difficult situations I ever
Raise
encountered.
your mic, we just can't hear back
There we go. There we go.
One of the most difficult situations I ever encountered is when the patient has no more room for treatment, and the family insists on the patient being treated. And because of current laws or whatever, you need to treat a patient shouldn't be treated. So is any way or any kind that you have experience with that? How do you deal with it?
Well, yeah, and if y'all are looking for, if you're looking for Wednesday night programs, I can put Susan in touch with a lady named Kelly Markham, who's the director of palliative care at Baptist. Okay, and all Kelly does all day is sit with families, trying to help them to understand that they are moving into what we call futile care with their loved one, and there are no more magic bullets, and there is no more treatment. And the family has not done a good job in being honest about their own grief and their pain and beginning to deal with it. Do y'all know that we spend 40% of our healthcare dollars in the last 60 days of life? 40% of our healthcare dollars are spent in the last 60 days of life. Billions and billions and billions of dollars in what we know as futile care. And the issue is we have not been able to get people and families to a place where they can accept the fact that this person is going to die. And so that's some of the hardest work we do, okay? Kelly Markham, Baptist Hospital, palliative care, we work together. She would love to come out here and talk about palliative care. It would be a wonderful program. She's superb. I wish I had a better answer. But what we can do is we can ready ourselves. You know, we can be not part of that 40%.
Can we really though? I mean, isn't it easy to sit and say, okay, if you're there, you know, I'll pull up a plug.
But when, I don't really know what that's gonna really be like. So as much as I say, yeah, I'll do the right thing, I won't let you.
Thank you. Well, and I think another thing that you do is you sit and look at, you sit and look at advanced directives, and you look at 5 wishes, and you look at those documents, and you pray over them, and you talk about them, and you make decisions, and you let your physician know, and you keep a copy in your purse.
So you don't have to do that when
It's done.
Yeah.
Which is why you plan your funeral now. Because all of a sudden, you got people having to make a ton of decisions at a time when they're least able to make good decisions. So another way to be kind to your pastor. Okay.
Amen.
Amen.
Don't tell the pastor you can't move territory.
Yeah. John?
I'm being urged by those around me to speak to the fact that in this part of the Diocese of the Central Gulf Coast, there are about 80 households of people who are retired connected with the Episcopal Church. And the bishop has appointed several retirees to be clergy to the retired. And Ann and I are one couple who are in that now. And we went to a conference sponsored by the National Church last April where chaplains to the retired from all over the church came. And I'm leading up to the fact that we're going to hold a conference for just retired clergy and people on the church pension fund this January. And Don knows about this. And here you have all these retired clergy. And the conference is going to deal, one, with the essential documents that people need to have when they reach end of life issues, but you got to do them now. You can't wait until the last minute.
Yeah.
And the second thing is we're going to have Kelly Martin come and speak to us on palliative care.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be doing that. But I guess my point is really there's a great need for this everywhere in our society for the very reason that Don talked about just then, that 40%. It's just amazing. And it's just the time in which we live. But we're going to be doing that for retired clergy and spouses. I want to, while I got the mic, I want to raise one other thing, and that is tell my story. We've just been to a clergy conference on telling story. And tell my story, which is a particular situation that we often face in the Southern culture in which we live. And that is when Ann's father had been moved to the nursing home and was dying, and we all knew it. The numbers were going down, etc. Ann and I were kind of the gatekeepers at the situation, and we went off and got some supper and came back to find 2 people, one of whom was a distant relative, who were trying to get him to say he was saved and so he could die in peace. And, I've forgotten many things in my life, but I'll always remember that. It was so painful, so painful.
Thank you.
And he died right away. But it was just so painful. We were trying to be gatekeepers and we lost.
I'm not so sure you lost. Thank you. Wow.
I have a story I'd like to share,
Okay.
real quick.
Well, you have to get the mic real quick.
Okay.
The bishop listens to all these, okay? I'll know that.
4 years ago, my sister-in-law died. She was 52 and she had cancer. And it was her second bout, and she chose not to go through chemotherapy again. And I was in her, she was in the hospital, I'm a nurse, and I was in there with her, and my brother was there. And she called me close to her, and she said to me, talk about people knowing, she said, I want to stay with you. I really do, but I can't. Do you know that? And it just, I'll never forget it. You know, she died that night. And it was just, you know.
I think people know.
Yeah, she knew it was coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know
Very
that the last sense that people lose is sense of hearing. You know that, and so be careful, because simply because someone's in a coma, we had a situation at the hospital, and this fellow has been in a coma forever, and two nurses were on either side of his bed, and one said to the other something like, we need this bed, I wish this guy would go ahead and die, or something. And the guy came out of the coma the next morning and said to the charge nurse, could I please see those two nurses that were here last night? I didn't talk to them. You know, so be careful. Sense of hearing is the last to go.
Quick story.
Quick story.
Quick story about silence. About 20-some years ago, I had radical prostatectomy. And I came out of the surgery and I felt like $1 million. And right after I came out, I was just sitting there and I brought in this tray of food, my lunch. And I said, well, I guess they want me to eat. So I cleaned my plate and had everything, including the red Jell-O. That evening, I got very upset in my stomach. And I started throwing up. And the guy in the bed next to me thought it was blood. This is the red Jell-O. And he's screaming for nurses to come and take care of this guy's dying. Well, I thought I was going to die right there. But I got up the next morning and I still felt pretty badly. My mother and my wife came right from lunch at the Olive Garden. And they must have had an extra dose of garlic. And they started fussing with me and, you know, and I said, please get out of here right now and don't come back until you're sure I'm feeling okay.
It's pretty universally true, and you probably experienced this, that every time you hear a story, it reminds you of one of your stories. And that's what's happened, and that's natural, it's universal, which is why we want to stay away from telling your story, because every time you hear a story, you think of one of yours. I mentioned Jell-O, and you think about Jell-O. Okay? And that's natural, that's the way it works. But that you don't go tell that story to somebody who had prostate surgery. You do that's when you use silence. You got it. Good. You need to be clear on that, okay?
That's funny.
So, anyway, we have time for one more question. Okay?
Make a statement.
Make a statement.
In regard to keeping silent, we have centering prayer service every Monday morning, and we are silent in prayer for 20 minutes.
Thank you.
Well, that's better than 8 seconds.
That's better than it is. It is. And that's a good thing, okay? Because I think that is planned, it's programmed, it's expected, it's formal, and yet it teaches you to be silent in those spontaneous times that could be a bit more awkward.
But you know, when you do go to something like that and you are silent for a long time, you feel like a new person. because you, I don't know, I can't explain it. Here you go. You can't hear me? No. I have such
It's a loud
can't hear you
voice.
over here.
I said, when you go to, well, like I went to a retreat for a whole Saturday, and it just about killed me not to talk. But we couldn't even talk through lunch. But we could read and just sit. We would go walk in the gardens, but we could not talk. And I had told Eddie afterwards, I said, I was so relaxed, just so real peaceful feeling inside when you do that.
Good.
And if you knew me, you know I have a hard time being quiet.
I've learned over the last 7 weeks.
That's awesome.
I relax too.
Thank y'all. We're done. Thank y'all.
Son, we have a small gift, a small token, and when you open it, it will reflect a little bit about your ability to teach. And you teach not just information, but you tell your story, and you tell other stories.